Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Recently, while I was kind of thinking about doing a video comparing how Margaret Mitchell in Gone with the Wind and William Faulkner in The Unvanquished portray Reconstruction and the South in the Civil War, I ran across an essay by James Baldwin talking about Faulkner and desegregation. As a matter of fact, the name of the essay is On Faulkner and Desegregation. And I read that essay, and like all, things I read by James Baldwin, it was, worldview changing, challenging, forced me to question some things, not just about Faulkner, but more importantly about myself. And in reading that and reading kind of Baldwin's dressing down, really, of Faulkner's position on desegregation in the 1950s, I found ways in which I thought what Baldwin was saying about desegregation in the 1950s, we could still apply in many ways, in a more general way, to problems we have with race and races in the United States. So the essay first. So in the essay, Baldwin kind of takes Faulkner to task for a number of statements that Faulkner made regarding efforts by African American civil rights groups, particularly the NAACP, and the federal government to kind of force, from Faulkner's point of view, to force desegregation in the South. Now, Faulkner liked to think of himself as a progressive Southerner on the issue of race, by which, he meant that he acknowledged that racial equality was reality, that was something that, was undeniable, and that was something that was coming. But at the same time, he felt like, and he expressed his belief that extremists, African Americans who he thought of as extremists who were trying to force desegregation, and the federal government were putting, progressive Southerners like him in a position where they had to choose sides, and that in his point of view, if you didn't give white Southerners enough chance to come to the conclusion to end segregation on their own, then they would more likely gravitate towards the extreme racist side. As a matter of fact, Faulkner famously, whether he was sober or not, said if it came down to it, he would defend Mississippi from federal troops, even if that meant going into the streets and shooting black people, which is an incredibly ridiculous position to take, I think, from our point of view today when we think about desegregation, because we think about desegregation as something that was obviously wrong, as something from the past. But I do think we fall into this trap of sounding a lot like Faulkner ourselves. Let me just read some quotes in which Baldwin is going to take on Faulkner's idea that forced desegregation will harm or prevent white moderate Southerners, progressive Southerners like himself, from being on the side of civil rights, that white Southerners just need time to come to these conclusions by themselves, and that change will come if you just let progressive white Southerners like himself take over. So the first quote I want to read you is this: "The sad truth is that whatever modifications have been effected in the social structure of the South since Reconstruction, and any alleviations of the Negro's lot within, are due to great and incessant pressure." So Baldwin is pointing out something that we now know, that you don't bring about changes in civil rights, you don't bring about changes in equality for African Americans or other groups of people in the United States without consistent and incredible pressure. That this is what actually brings about change, and that Faulkner was here clearly wrong, and Baldwin was right. Baldwin's second quote: "As far as the Negro's life in the South is concerned, the NAACP is the only organization which has struggled to raise him to the level of citizen. For this reason alone, it cannot be equated, as Faulkner equates it, with the pathological Citizens' Council. One organization is working within the law, and the other is working against and outside it." So, in the 1950s, the primary civil rights organization in the United States was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And these citizens' councils were literally white racist organizations that got together to plan ways to resist calls for racial equality and racial integration. As a matter of fact, citizens' councils in some states actually convinced people to close down public schools rather than to, actually desegregate when the time actually came. And, to me, this quote has lots of parallels with the way in which we see the Black Lives Matter movement portrayed as a kind of radical, extremist organization. And oftentimes the people who want to call Black Lives Matter that kind of organization, say, well, it's the same thing, only on the opposite side from groups like the Proud Boys, or the Oath Keepers, or the Three Percenters, or the Boogaloo Boys. And as Baldwin points out here, with Faulkner equating the NAACP with the White Citizens Council, or the Citizens Council, that's just a ridiculous comparison. One is fighting for social justice. One is fighting for, in the case of Black Lives Matter, to put an end to the police killing of unarmed black men and women in the United States of America, and the other groups are fighting to prevent justice. That literally is what's happening. Baldwin's third quote: Faulkner is so plaintive concerning this middle of the road from which extremist elements of both races are driving him that it does not seem unfair to ask just what he has been doing there until now. Where is the evidence of the struggle he has been carrying on there on behalf of the Negro? Why, if he and his enlightened confreres in the South have been boring from within to destroy segregation, do they react with such panic when the walls show any signs of failing? So to me, this is really the quote which resonates with me in modern times today. What Baldwin is basically saying to Faulkner is, Faulkner, you say that you being in the middle of the road, a progressive Southern on the issue of race, is the way in which, would bring about change, gradual, eventual change. People like Faulkner was saying, if left to their own devices, would bring segregation to an end. And Baldwin's saying, where's the evidence that that's true? Where is the evidence? Where are the things that you and people who you say agree with you, people who you say, groups like the NAACP and civil rights organizations who are demanding an end to desegregation, where is the evidence that you've done anything that helped African Americans? Where is the evidence that anything that you've done has made a difference? And if you really are so committed to racial justice, if you really are committed to these concepts of equality, why are you resisting, efforts to bring that equality about? Why are you screaming and hollering about, oh my goodness, this is wrong and you're going to cause more problems? If this is the goal to which you've been working this whole time. I think that's an incredibly important thing. And for us today, in the United States of America today, I think it is reflected in the fact that so many Americans now believe themselves to be, and I won't argue with them, to not be racist, but to feel like that, from their point of view, extremist groups are kind of pushing them in the direction of racist. If you just left us all alone, things will kind of work out well. I'm not a racist. Why are you making me feel bad? Kind of thing. That's essentially what Faulkner was saying here too. He's saying just leave us alone. We're not racist. We believe in equality and all that stuff, and eventually things will work themselves out. Which brings me back to the initial quote about the only way in which these changes actually come about is through sustained and consistent pressure. So, to me, this whole argument that Baldwin here makes, this essay in which Baldwin is really taking down Faulkner's arguments against desegregation, that we could apply that to issues involving race today. And to me, since the inauguration of the new governor of Virginia, and his first executive order was to try to end the teaching of critical race theory in public schools in Virginia, where it was not being taught to begin with. This then the whole election of Youngkin and the making of critical race theory into a political issue kind of smacks of the exact kind of things that Baldwin is dressing Faulkner down for here. So part of what I think is necessary for me to get from Baldwin talking about and taking Faulkner to task for supporting segregation or for advocating a slow change to segregation is to replace segregation with what really segregation was, and that's whiteness. Now this is a term that as soon as I use, I know a lot of people are going to become really defensive about me using the term whiteness. So let me give you the definition that I'm applying here. You don't have to agree with this definition outside of this essay, but within this essay, this is the definition I'm using for whiteness. So, whiteness does not simply refer to skin color, but an ideological base an ideology based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes which result in the unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. Whiteness represents a position of power where the power holder defines social categories and reality. So when people, and this I believe is a definition that will be broadly accepted in, by the people who actually teach critical race theory and write and research on critical race theory at the university level. I think this is a definition which most of them would find to be their definition of whiteness. But using that definition of whiteness, I want you to understand that when we talk about destroying whiteness, we're not talking about killing or destroying white people. We're talking about destroying that power structure where privilege and all the other things that go in power are distributed based on race, with, in this sense, the white people having the majority of that power, the majority of that privilege. So I think that's a really important concept, that this concept of whiteness is something, as I've defined it here, this concept of whiteness is something that we, me, as a white person, really has to grapple with, And I think one of the things we have to do is not react defensively and say, well, that's not me. I don't believe in, distributing power and privilege based on race. That's well and good. That is exactly where Faulkner would have been on the issue of desegregation. He doesn't believe in segregation. He doesn't support that kind of system. But the real question is, then what are we willing to do about it? And as Baldwin would say, it's not good enough just to be in the middle of the road, just to be here saying, I don't support this, that's not me. That if we're not taking some kind of action, if we're not doing what we can with our votes, with our voice, with whatever it is, to make that situation or make that whiteness, as defined here, untrue, to change that, then we're really no better than Faulkner, resisting desegregation and saying, oh, everything will work itself out fine if you just leave, us alone. Only here, leave white people alone who aren't racist to, bring about change slowly and gradually. I think that's a really important concept. Now, if you're going to challenge the idea that we have a system, or if you don't agree with the idea that we have a system in which, whiteness is still the rule, let me remind you of American history and various things in American history which are based on this idea of whiteness. And again, let me remind you, it is an ideology based on beliefs, values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes which result in an unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. So imperialism, is that imperialism as it exists in, the, 15th through the 19th, 20th centuries, is that imperialism an example of whiteness? I think it almost certainly is. How about the genocide against Native Americans? The assimilation, the forced assimilation of Native Americans, where we literally have governments run by white people telling Native Americans, being a Native American is wrong, you should be more like us. Is that not whiteness? Slavery itself, particularly chattel slavery, is practiced in the United States, deciding that some people's value were as forced laborers and creating an economic system based on that kind of forced labor. That is the values of white people determining and distributing power and freedom, in this case, based on skin color. Follows slavery when slavery comes to an end because of the Civil War. Again, remember Baldwin saying, we don't bring about change unless there's consistent and extreme forceful pressure. The Civil War being an example of that. Civil War is followed by the creation of black codes and Jim Crow, which were literally laws enacted by white Southerners to keep white Southerners in power and to keep African Americans down. You cannot debate that that's what Jim Crow and Jim Crow laws and segregation laws and the black codes were about. They were about exactly that. Segregation itself was about power. It was about white people with power using that power to maintain power by depriving African Americans the right to vote, to keep themselves in power, to keep themselves in the positions of economic dominance, which they did through all kinds of ways. That's an example of whiteness. The Ku Klux Klan literally is founded on almost on this definition of whiteness. They said what was American is what was white. What was American was what was white and non-Catholic, etc. They were defining American citizenship based on whiteness. You could say the exact same things about white supremacist groups that exist today. They are looking at the world, they're looking at the United States, they are looking at American values through this lens of whiteness and say, whiteness is what's right, everybody else has to conform, everybody else has to bow to this whiteness, or they are wrong. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, this isn't critical race theory, this isn't today, there's a real big difference there. You know, I don't think it's an accident, and I'm sure you don't either. The Tea Party faction of the Republican Party was formed after the election of Barack Obama, and that one of those major issues the Tea Party had was what we call birtherism, questioning whether or not Obama was actually a citizen. You can't tell me that doesn't have a racial whiteness overtone to it. The rise of the Oath Keepers, the rise of the Three Percenters, the rise of right-wing white supremacist extreme groups are a product of this, and as is this reaction to critical race theory. Now, specifically with critical race theory, I think that that there are two quotes from Baldwin's essay about Faulkner and desegregation that really kind of hammer this point home. The difficulty, perhaps, is that the Southerner clings to two entirely antithetical doctrines, two legends, two histories. Like all other Americans, he must subscribe and is to some extent controlled by the beliefs and the principles expressed in the Constitution. At the same time, those beliefs and principles seem determined to destroy the South. He is, on the one hand, the proud citizen of a free society, and on the other is committed to a society which has not yet dared to free itself of the necessity of naked and brutal oppression. Now I'm going to read the same quote, and I'm going to take Southerner and the South out, and I'm going to replace it with white Americans and whiteness. The difficulty perhaps is that white Americans cling to two entirely antithetical doctrines, two legends, two histories. Like all other Americans, he must subscribe and is to some extent controlled by the beliefs and the principles expressed in the Constitution. At the same time, those beliefs and principles seem determined to destroy whiteness. He is on the one hand the proud citizen of a free society, and on the other is committed to a society which has not yet dared to free itself from the necessity of naked and brutal oppression. That quote speaks directly to me to this, what is really an entirely made-up issue surrounding critical race theory. That critical race theory challenges whiteness's definition of American history. It challenges our view of American history and how white people view American history as a history of heroic colonial settlers, bringers of democracy. You know, and yes, we may acknowledge they do some bad stuff too, but you know, that's not important because what they did, other stuff they did was so great. That is an inherently whiteness point of view or interpretation of American history. And because critical race theory challenges that, critical race theory has become then a focus of a lot of this kind of reactionary, right-wing, white citizen grief and upset and determination to hold on to real American values. Notice those real American values are defined by this definition of whiteness. You know, this is something that I think, and for me, we have to resist. We have to stop being defensive and start being proactive and bringing about, you know, a realization and acceptance of the reality of the way our society works, of the reality of how racism still and whiteness still is about distribution of power in the United States of America. Baldwin, you know, is always, you know, one of the great things about James Baldwin is he always leaves us with hope and a path forward and a vision of a better future. And so I want to close this video with a quote which he begins his essay. Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one identity and the end of safety. And at such moments, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreamed that one possessed. Yet it is only when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a privilege he has long possessed that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams and greater privileges. This is something that just spoke to me so directly that when I'm as guilty of, you know, I think I'm as guilty of having some of this whiteness point of view embedded in me and still coming out and still maybe dictating my initial reactions, you know, as anybody. But I think, you know, one of the things that I have to do then, or one of the things I want to do is to evaluate my reactions to all kinds of things and to see if my reaction is based on my desire to cling to this old structure that whiteness created in the United States and these old beliefs that whiteness created. And like Baldwin, I believe that when we stop doing that, when we stop reacting defensively to the efforts of people of different races in this country to achieve freedom and equality and equity in this country, we stop seeing that as an attack on us. We stop being defensive. We stop trying to defend that old whiteness point of view, which, you know, we have been, you know, grown up with. If you're a white person in the United States like me, then we will be able to move forward as a nation to a much better future. You know, that may sound hokey and idealistic, but we are better than we were in the 1950s and the 1940s. And it wasn't because people resisted change, it was because people embraced that change and they challenged their old ideas and they challenged their old values, and they're willing to accept and try to move towards an unknown, possibly scary future, but one which was a lot brighter. Anyway, I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.